Kia ora koutou. Fabulous to have you all here, and I just need to start with a few thank yous. Rachel Brown and the team at SBN, who are phenomenal individuals, and they just do phenomenal work, and we feel very privileged to be able to come to your whānau and your space, and thank you very much for your manaakitanga. We really appreciate it. A big thank you to Malika and Hannah, who, from SBN and Drive Electric, that have worked so very hard to create these events. There's so much more that goes on behind the scenes. And thank you also, these events couldn't happen without the help of sponsors. So we've got Ecotricity and ChargeNet. Now, thank you everyone that is online today as well. It's great to see a fabulous turnout, and we're on quite a tight time frame, so I just want to introduce the fantastic James Vickery from London, and thank you for agreeing to come and speak. Policy is just so very important when you think what's happened in the last 18 months with policy changes. The average in 2023 EV sales were sitting at 27%. On average each month, and we saw significant policy changes. They went from 51% in December 2023 to 2.5% in January 24. Last year they were sitting at 7.7%. So the feedback from everyone online, the feedback that we're going to do today in the workshop is really important for us to be able to go and see both sides of the aisle and advocate for better policies to accelerate e-mobility in New Zealand. So thank you for everyone that's contributed to the worksheet, and thank you that everyone's joining for the workshop. And it's been pretty tough going in New Zealand, so it's fabulous to have James here from the UK. He is an absolute expert in EV policy, working for the zero-emission, which is, they have a whole department on zero-emission in the UK, far more advanced than what we've got happening in New Zealand. So it's fabulous to have your knowledge and your inspiration. So I'll hand over to you, and thank you very much for agreeing to join us today.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. As Kristen said, I'm James Vickery. I am the head of policy within the OZEV regulations branch at the Office for Zero Emission Vehicles in the UK. I'm really just going to talk you through the UK's experience, what we've kind of done over the past few years, how we're getting on with the ZEV transition, what's working, what isn't, so on and so on. So I will just share my screen. I do have some slides for you. And I just wanted to really ground everything we're doing with a bit of carbon context, first of all. So in terms of the UK and our general ambition, I'm going to start back to 2008, and we'll start with what we call the Climate Change Act, which is the UK's kind of landmark piece of legislation that legally mandated that the UK must be a net zero economy by 2050, which obviously is a fantastic thing. But underneath that, we have a series of what are called carbon budgets, which is quite literally a budget of carbon that the economy can emit on a rolling 5-year period. That's the graph that you've got on the left-hand side. And I suppose the important points to mark there are the drops from the third bar to the fourth bar, so carbon budget 3 to 4, and from carbon budget 5 to 6. They are significant drops that are going to require a significant amount of action across all sectors of the economy. When it comes to transport, and supposed to every sector, the amount that each sector will need to save is kept confidential. But on the right-hand side, you've got the chart of how each sector has achieved over the past few years. And that top line is transport. If you go back to 1990 on the left-hand side, we are not the top line. And our emissions have basically stalled over the past 35 years. And that's obviously not because our vehicles have stayed the same, but it's more people have cars and more people are ordering things online, being delivered by vans, and more miles are being driven. So we really need to take some drastic action in terms of what we're doing to save that carbon. And just to really hammer that home, again, what we've got here on the left-hand side is the share of emissions by different transport sector. And on the right-hand side, you've got the actual megatonnage of CO2. 2021 is the most recent data we have for obvious reasons. I won't talk about that, but I'll go to 1990 and 2019. And if you look at cars, taxis, HGVs and vans, the actual megatons of CO2 being emitted went up over a 30-year period. So lots and lots of action needed from OZEV. And this is where, indeed, OZEV kicks in. So we are a joint department between the Department for Transport and the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. We were established in 2013 to kind of kickstart the low-emission vehicle revolution. And nowadays we are a team of 125 people covering quite literally everything across the ecosystem. I myself am the head of policy for ZEV regulation, so I look after the supply side regulations, but we tackle everything from charge points, we tackle grid connections, making sure the grid can handle all the energy we need. You know, if there is an aspect of the ecosystem that needs to be looked at, we are looking at it. And that's probably where I'm going to start. I mentioned about regulation. That's my patch, and it's probably the landmark piece of legislation we've got kind of specifically on ZEVs, which is our ZEV mandate. Now, I won't go through everything we've got on screen, but essentially we have had CO2 regulation for new cars since 2009, first in the EU, then out of the EU, and then through the ZEV mandate as well. And we moved to a ZEV mandate style regulation where we require manufacturers sell ZEVs rather than trying to reduce CO2, really to try and guarantee that wider charging system. You know, if you've got vehicles that need a plug, you kind of guarantee the charging demand, and you then theoretically guarantee the investment and the return on the investment for investors putting charge points into the ground. We're kind of guaranteeing the carbon emissions. I'm sure you know that the label CO2 of a new car or a new van tends to not be the real world CO2 of the vehicles. But it also then puts kind of our domestic manufacturers at the forefront of the transition. A lot of countries are going zero emission. The EU and the UK are both aiming for 2035. If we have a strong regulation now, it requires UK manufacturers to put the vehicles in the ground and to change their plants, and so on and so on. So there are lots and lots of benefits there that we perceive from the ZEV mandate. What I want to run you through is basically how it works very quickly. So the ZEV mandate is a series of trading schemes. And what we do is we set a zero emission vehicle target each year, and theoretically manufacturers need to meet that. But if they don't, they are free to buy credits, if you like, from other manufacturers. Our tradable thing, our tradable non-fungible item, we call allowances. And an allowance is basically permission to do the thing we don't want you to do. So our car target last year was 22%. It means that manufacturers are allowed to sell 78% non-ZEV. And what we'll then do is provide that budget to them. So if you sell 100,000 cars, we'll give you 78,000 allowances, and you sell an allowance every single time you spend an allowance every single time you sell a non-zero emission vehicle. That way, if you sell more ZEVs than you need to, you've got spare allowances at the end of the year that you can sell on an open market. And conversely, if you don't sell enough ZEVs, you've spent all your allowances and you can go and buy them. So that accounts for cars and for vans. So the van target was 10%. We also have a CO2 standard alongside that basically says, okay, we want you to pivot all of your investment, all of your R&D into ZEV. So whatever your non-zero emissions were in 2021, keep doing that. You don't have to get any better, just don't get any worse. And therefore, we've got 4 different trading schemes: a car ZEV, a car non-ZEV, van non-ZEV. And they also talk to each other. Now, we brought this regulation in on a moment's notice in the vehicle world. From laying the legislation to entering into force, it was about 3 months. So we've had to build in a series of flexibilities to make sure that while we guarantee the ZEVs and guarantee the carbon savings, that it's still sustainable for manufacturers to meet as they get used to the new requirements. So again, very quickly, because I'm conscious of time, we've got 5 broad flexibilities in the scheme. The first is the CO2 transfers. I've already mentioned we've got a ZEV scheme and a non-ZEV scheme. Well, if you sell more ZEVs than you need to, you can transfer those ZEVs into the non-ZEV scheme to offset any increases in CO2 that you do have. And likewise, for a few years, if you do reduce your non-ZEV CO2 emissions, you can convert that back into ZEVs as well. We also have a banking and borrowing system, which is if you beat your ZEV target, you can bank the over-compliance for use in future years. And if you miss your ZEV target, well, that's okay. We'll charge you a 3.5% interest rate, and you can catch back up by 2027. Derogations, those are for small volume manufacturers. We've got a huge small volume manufacturer base in the UK, like Aston Martin, McLaren, but also really small manufacturers like Caterham, Noble, BAC. We want them to transition by 2035 as well, but obviously they don't have the same ability to do so as the major volumes. So what we say for them is that, okay, we'll give you a 0% CO2 target, but if you do sell ZEVs, you can still engage in the trading market. So they've got a bonus only mechanism, if you like. They've still got an incentive to sell ZEVs, but if they can't, we understand why. And then finally, we've got bonus credits. And these are the kind of concept of selling ZEVs in certain areas or to certain companies to kind of make sure there's an equitable transition. So we offer bonuses for special purpose vehicles, things like ambulances. We offer bonuses for zero emission wheelchair accessible vehicles, and bonuses for any zero emission vehicles that are sold into car clubs or shared mobility schemes, basically to ensure that those who can't afford to buy a vehicle can still access a battery electric vehicle. Now, after all of that, if someone's still non-compliant, then they've got to make a payment. And the payments are quite stringent. For every car that a manufacturer is short, it's £15,000. On the van side, this year it's 18,000. It was 9,000 last year. And there are also payments that need to be made on the CO2 side. So it is a very ambitious piece of regulation. And I think that has been demonstrated through some of the engagement that we've had throughout 2024 and early into this year. I think where manufacturers thought they would be in mid-23 when we delivered the legislation is not quite where they've ended up. And there's been a lot of calls to amend the ZEV mandate, you may have seen in the press and so on, to make sure that it's a bit more sustainable. So we've just held a consultation to look at whether we should be making the flexibilities more flexible. But alongside that, and I'll just flip back a slide, we also have a commitment to end the sale of petrol and diesel cars by 2030. So although we may make the ZEV mandate a bit more flexible in the short term, if on that chart on the right-hand side, you'll see in the top right-hand corner, we've got a bit of a cream-coloured wedge. What we're saying there is that until 2030, you're free to sell petrol and diesel cars, but from 2030, they will need to be hybridized in some fashion. You will not be allowed to sell a pure ICE car anymore. Now, exactly what the definition is still to be decided. That's going to come when we publish the government response to the consultation. But we're kind of giving with one hand, we're going to be taking in the other, if I can phrase it that way. I suppose the question is, we've had that regulation in place for a year and a bit now. What has it done for our ZEV volumes? Now, I know at the start you mentioned you had a change of government and your CO2 regulations have gone away. We've had 5 prime ministers in 5 years. And we've demonstrated that we can just about still sell ZEV. So you've got there the chart from 21 to 24 in our year-to-date in 2025. On the car side, we got to 19.6% ZEV last year, which obviously is not 22%. But with the flexibilities, it means that manufacturers have basically met what we needed them to. On the van side, we only got to 6.3%. Now, the flexibility should still allow manufacturers to generally comply, but that is, being honest, quite low. It's lower than we thought it would be. And that's part of the reason we've consulted on making the changes. And this comes into where we're facing some of the barriers. I'll tackle the left-hand side in a minute. Those are to do with grants and how we're incentivizing vehicles. But particularly on the van side, we've got a lot of additional challenges that cars just simply don't have. These are business tools, and batteries are heavier than engines. And the cutoff between kind of a light-duty, a van and an HGV in the UK is 3.5 tons. So if you have a 3.5 ton van and you're putting batteries in it, you either lose payload or you go over the threshold, and you have to deal with a lot of additional kind of type approval requirements. You've got to put a tachograph on the vehicle, you've got to put additional safety measures in, all things that add to the cost of the van, which are basically putting people off buying them. So we're trying to tackle all of those through having an exemption up to 4.25 tons within the ZEV mandate. We've got a driving license exemption, again, up to 4.25 tons. But there are still issues that we know we need to tackle. In terms of additional issues, perceptions as well is a huge one. There are constant media reports about EV batteries being worse for the environment than a combustion engine car, or that you can't recycle them, or that they lose their charge all the time, or that EVs catch fire, so on and so on and so on. I'm sure you're used to this yourself. So we've got a huge press department in DFT who is trying to tackle all of that as well. The one thing we do have, again, within the ZEV mandate is that we have that basically, in order to qualify as a ZEV, a manufacturer must offer a battery warranty. So an 8-year, 100,000 mile warranty. And if the vehicle loses or goes beneath 70% car or 65% van battery capacity, you have to have a free replacement. So again, all of these little things trying to tackle all of the kind of the small vehicle side issues. On the left-hand side, those are to do with our incentives. We've got lots of plug-in grants for vans, wheelchair accessible vehicles, taxis, and so on. These range from kind of £500 up to the heaviest trucks, which receive a £25,000 grant. We no longer have a plug-in car grant, so that's another area that we've lost. We had a grant up until 2022. When we got to double digits in terms of sales figures, that was the point that the then government said, okay, no more car grants. But we still do have a lot of taxation benefits as well to do with kind of vehicle excise duty, annual taxes on cars. Our rules actually changed today, which as an EV owner is a shame. So EVs have been exempt up until today. Today they start paying those taxes, but we still have company car tax, which is how vehicles are taxed if you get a company car, and first year allowances as well, if you are claiming a car as part of your business expenditure. So that's, I'll call the vehicle side. Infrastructure continues also to be a significant issue. Now, I've put the bullets on there. I'm going to go into a bit more detail. But I'll start again with how the UK is getting on with infrastructure deployment. And I think you can just see, going from on the left-hand side of the graph, from left to right, that's our publicly available charging infrastructure. As you go up, kind of the darker the colour, the faster the charge point. We have more than doubled the number of charge points on UK roads over the past kind of 4 years. We've gone from, what's that, less than 30,000 to over 75,000. On the right-hand side, you've then got your domestic charge points. Now, there's no one methodology for this. Not every charge point is funded by government or is tracked by the government. So the UK government estimate is that we think there are 680,000 charge points. ZapMap, which is the UK's private charge point map, they estimate over 1 million. But that won't include people like me who don't actually have a charge point at home. I've got an EV, but I don't have a charge point because I don't commute. So I just use a very standard plug to charge my car very, very slowly. But in terms of kind of the challenges that we are coming through, I've included a few things on the screen, but there are many, many more things than I've put on there. So we'll start with funding first of all. Funding is always an issue, and so we have a number of grants to try and encourage people to put charge points in the ground. So our electric vehicle charge point scheme generally offers up to £350 or 75% of the cost of the charge point for difficult places to put the charge point. So it's not for people who have got off-street parking. We used to have a grant for that. We don't have that anymore. But it's more for people who rent, who live in flats, who don't have off-street parking, are reliant on on-street infrastructure. If you're a landlord and you look after lots of properties or tower blocks, you can also apply for grants to put charge points in. For those, they can also apply for building work grants as well, for things like rewiring or putting ducting in place. Residential car parks as well, and small and medium enterprises, they can all apply for charge points. We also have a workplace charging scheme. So if people are driving to work, again, the workplace can apply for grants to put the charge points in the company car park. And there's a separate one for schools as well. The schools is a fairly new one that we've separated out, but already we've got over 1,000 charge points put into schools. And then separately, we also have a local EV infrastructure scheme, which is £381 million for local authorities to get on-street infrastructure available, again, for people who park outside the house, but they don't have a driveway or whatever it may be. Again, on the funding side, we've got a rapid charge point funding scheme, which is all about upgrading the grid at motorway service areas. So if you're on a motorway, generally the service stations tend to be in places that are away from the rest of the world, if I can phrase it that way. Makes it very difficult to get energy to them. So this is a pilot project looking at how we can upgrade the grid around them. And there are various other kind of bits of support that OZEV offers to everyone in the sector. There's also things like guidance for installers, for distributed network operators, for energy suppliers, and so on. But there are also a lot of technical barriers that we are intending to try and overcome. So a few that I've kind of made notes on. Permitted development rights. So these are things that you can do building-wise that don't require either planning permission or permission from your local authority. We're intending to allow EV building work to progress without necessarily needing that planning permission in the first place, to reduce the red tape and reduce the time and cost around that. Same with grid connections, looking to resolve all of the common issues surrounding the rollout, outline best practice, clarify which companies are responsible for which roles, because there are lots of different stakeholders within our electrical grid. Again, providing private enterprise with guidance. Streetworks, the needs currently, if you are performing any form of road work, whether that's kind of gas, electric, or putting charge points in, you need a license from your local authority. So trying to see if we can reform that. And in the home, there are a few things there as well. We passed a law a couple of years ago that requires that all new build homes and new build commercial properties must have charge points installed from the moment that the building is built. So they're making it easier to make sure that people can charge when they need to. The other thing I want to mention there as well, which I actually haven't included on the slide, is to do with accessible charging. So a lot of the charge points in the UK are not accessibility friendly, whether that is people who use a wheelchair or have other accessible needs. So last year we developed a technical standard to make sure that those charge points do become accessibility friendly, and we are kind of working with CPOs on that front to make sure that that is rolled out and then enforced. Now there's still a lot to do. A lot of what I've just said has not been legislated for yet. So the accessible charging standard is still new. We're still working with CPOs on that front. And I think one of the bigger barriers as well for us is that we don't have any signage. This is a personal one rather than a personal view rather than a government view. But right now we have no signage anywhere on the UK road network, whether that is kind of in the middle of towns or on the motorways. there are no signs of service stations to say that there are charge points. It says that there's a petrol station, but no charge points. So that is something that I, again, personal view, would be keen for OZEV to take a look at as we go along. All of that is to do with cars and vans. So very quickly, I'll touch on HGVs as well. HGVs, very different place to cars and vans. The chart on the right-hand side shows our HGV uptake, and you just basically need to look at the bottom of that chart. You've got your likes of Norway and Germany are doing pretty well. Norway's achieved 4% year-on-year sales. We are hovering at about 0.6%, which is less than half of the EU average, let alone comparable economies like Germany and France. So with that, I've mentioned the plug-in truck grant already, but our kind of key bit of work on HGVs is the zero-emission HGV and infrastructure demonstrator programme. This is a £200 million programme, which really is attempting to demonstrate that kind of 40 to 44 tonne trucks can be made zero emission. Doesn't necessarily need to be electric in this case, could be hydrogen as well. But what we're trying to do is demonstrate that it can be done. It will grow confidence in the long run. But it's also designed to try and accumulate that biggest possible data set. Where do trucks in the UK go? Where might their recharging or refueling needs take place? Is that on a motorway? What happens in terms of the depots? If you are point to point, do you need to put charge points in at your depot? What are the barriers that you're looking to overcome to do so? If you don't own your depot, is your landlord allowing you to do that? So really working through all of these questions on the HGV side. The timings for that. So the successful consortia were announced a couple of years ago. We plan to have the vehicles and the infrastructure live by March 2026. And then it's a 5-year data collection program. But we will make all of that data publicly available as well. So if any of you are in the HGV space and would be interested, very, very happy to put you in touch with the team. I've absolutely rattled through that, gone as quickly as I can. I haven't touched on buses. I haven't touched on motorbikes, anything like that. We have ambitions to phase all non-zero emission forms of anything with wheels out at some point. We've consulted or held a call for evidence on quite literally everything at this point. But yes, appreciate that there's a lot of information in a very short amount of time. So very, very happy to take questions. And I will caveat now, if there is a question I can't answer, I will make sure I get you an answer in due course.
Okay, we're going to move through to questions. Have we got any questions from the room? Go Eric.
Kia ora, James. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. Great amount of detail. Would love to get a copy of the slides if possible. One of the quick questions I had is, you talked about the incentive regime with regards to the various different tiers for importers and vehicle suppliers. And at the end of it, you talked about kind of a payment incentive scheme. That's the ZEV incentive scheme of the £15,000 you mentioned. How does that effectively flow through to get monetized as a benefit to the consumer? Do you anticipate that has a straight direct, all those layers that you described there, a straight direct sticker price incentive? How does that 15,000 ultimately make its way through? And do you anticipate it'll have a real impact on uptake?
So what I say on the 15 and 18,000, being completely blunt, because it's a trading scheme, we're not really ever expecting anyone to make those payments. All the flexibilities and the trading amongst different manufacturers should mean that everyone can comply without having to make kind of the backup payment. Now, if someone did make one, it comes to government and then it gets disseminated through various budget streams. What I will say is that is a significant incentive to comply through any means possible. So what we saw quite significantly at the back end of last year, as manufacturers started to realise, oh, the target's only 2%, I've got 2-3 months to kind of make sure that I'm compliant, we saw really significant discounting of vehicles. We were seeing, I'll say this from a personal perspective, I've got a second-hand Volkswagen ID3. A brand new ID3 at the end of last year was cheaper than I paid for my second-hand one. Manufacturers are realising it just makes more sense to discount heavily and make compliance to avoid the £15,000 payment or to have to engage in the trading sector than it was to kind of stick with what they were doing and then have to engage anyway. So we have definitely seen significant discounts. Whether that continues, we'll have to see as the targets have increased this year. Thanks.
Any other questions from the room? Oh, Danusha.
Thanks, James, for that. I had a question for you around your heavy goods vehicles. I noticed that Norway and Germany had achieved a different outcome. I'd be curious as to what do you think the policy differential is in those two markets, or is it an underlying routing and use challenge?
That's a great question. I think I'll take Norway, mostly because I know the Norwegian system better, because it's the one that always comes up when we're having these discussions. I think with Norway, if I can describe it, they went all in on the transition. Now, they've been very honest with us in discussions. They had, back in the mid-2000s, a domestic EV manufacturer that they were looking to support. That failed for various reasons, but it meant that they basically changed their entire system to suit electric vehicles. They have a really, really heavy sales tax for anything that's not electric, and they take all of that money from the sales tax and discount electric vehicles. They've had non-financial benefits in terms of free parking in cities, free access to cities, use of bus lanes and mobility lanes. So they've really tried to make it as easy as possible and as cheap as possible to use electric vehicles, whether that be cars or all the way up to HGVs. Now, I will say, a personal view, obviously Norway is in a different financial position to most countries. They have the sovereign wealth fund. They can dip into that when they need to kind of make sure they meet their policy aims. That's something we don't have, which means we haven't been able to put the various taxation and the same level of benefit and disincentive in place as Norway. But that would be my view. When it comes to the wider Europe, so Europe does also have the alternative fuel infrastructure regulation, which mandates that member states have certain types of infrastructure, depending on where they are, how many vehicles they've got, and on their strategic road network. Part of Brexit means that doesn't apply to us. And I definitely think that our focus has been on car and van, which, I mean, that's a personal view, but I would suggest that that's also part of the reason why we're just not in the same space on HGVs yet.
Awesome, thank you for that complex response, much appreciated. I've got a couple of questions that have come in online, but have we got any others? Michael Roth. Over to you.
Thank you for that. Could you tell us what government is doing to support the electrification of buses, and also any other way you're dealing with local authorities so they can contribute to this transition?
Yeah, absolutely. So buses, being blunt, a lot of our bus companies are going zero emission anyway. They haven't really needed to have the same level of incentive. I think because a bus is such a, it's a business tool. And if a if a bus operator can put a charge point in at the depot where the bus is going to be going every night anyway, it makes more sense. And if they can reduce their fuel cost to almost nothing, the financials already add up. So we haven't really had to support the bus sector in the same way as all other vehicles. We have consulted on phasing out all non-zero emission buses. I'll have to double check if we've actually responded to that consultation, but we definitely consulted on it. So yeah, buses, I would say, are the furthest along. In terms of local authorities, there is a significant program within OZEV to work with them predominantly on the charge point side. I think with a lot of them, it's a bit of a step into the unknown. You go back 5-10 years, they haven't had to consider any of this, and all of a sudden they're being asked to change their planning rules, and they're having to reconsider how you use road space and the pedestrian pavement space. So yeah, we've got a significant program of engagement. We have guidance documents for them, and we really just try and make sure that they have every tool that they need to facilitate this transition. One of the things we also have is LEVI, the Local Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Grants Programme. That is the 380 odd million pounds that is designed specifically for local authorities. So provided they've got all the knowledge, they don't then have the financial issue, because we are providing the funding for them to be able to do whatever it is ultimately that their residents want them to do.
Got a question, it'll be a heavy transport one, coming from Alphonse.
Yeah, hi James. How have you addressed the compensation for loss of payload and heavy goods vehicles in policy in the UK?
Yeah, it's definitely still an issue. So I say the couple of things that we have done almost immediately is that a van, for the purposes of the ZEV mandate, can go up to 4.25 tons instead of our 3.5 ton limit. So basically giving an additional 750 kilos for the batteries if it's needed. Same with driver's licenses. So we've had kind of a derogation in place for a while, whereby a standard driver's license that normally cuts you off at 3.5 tons, again, you can go up to 4.25 tons. Now, previously, you've had to do a half day's training to demonstrate. We have passed legislation, or we've put legislation through just last week to make that a permanent change. But yeah, there are definitely still issues. I think that the biggest one that always comes through is the fact that just because you're over 3.5 tons, that means you have to put a tacho on the vehicle. You have to put side skirts on so that if someone has a side collision, and there are lots and lots of different things that all add up to add additional weight to the vehicle and increase the cost of the vehicle, which really is putting van owners off using them. Now, we are looking at how to reform a lot of that. It's difficult in a way because that comes into our product standard and type approval rules, which don't apply across the UK. They only apply in Great Britain because in Northern Ireland, they are stuck with the EU rules because of how Brexit works. And so we can't change the EU rules. We can only change what happens in Great Britain. And then the politics gets involved. Do you want the vehicles in Great Britain to be of a different standard to those in Northern Ireland? And it can get a bit messy, but we are definitely looking to see what we can do to further reduce the technical burden on van drivers and van owners.
Okay, Al Yates.
Thank you, James. Vehicle to grids, is there any policy or regulation that's on the horizon, and how far away is it?
Not yet is the honest answer. It's definitely something we're aware of. One of the things that the previous administration had said in one of our consultations with the ZEV mandate is that we could theoretically use the ZEV mandate to incentivize either vehicle to grid or vehicle to everything technologies. That hasn't happened yet, and the new administration, the Labour government, haven't given an opinion on that yet. So, as it currently stands, nothing on the horizon. But that's not to say we aren't aware of it significantly. Yeah, that's probably what I have to say on that point at the moment.
Brilliant. Any other questions from the room? Danusha, you're allowed another question.
Hey, James. There's probably two things I'm really interested in. So I think you've done a great amount of work, and I can see how the foundations have shaped the landscape there. And we would all love 120 people working on electrification in New Zealand. I just watched a whole lot of people do the math in their heads. So that's really positive to see. You know, you've got this deadline looming. What do you think the car manufacturers are doing, or are you seeing pushback from the car manufacturers? In New Zealand, I think we have a very effective vehicle-based lobby. And we have seen some shifts in policy and some orientations that have really taken us a step back from electrification as a strong conversation. Do you see vehicle manufacturers perhaps, are they active in that space, or are they going to ramp up as those deadlines draw close?
I would say that the vehicle manufacturing lobbying industry is very active. That's how I'm going to diplomatically put it. I think what has helped us in the UK, and I'll say in wider Europe, is that, you know, even through all of our prime ministerial changes and so on, we've been really clear that 2035, so the end of sale of all non-zero emission cars, vans, and HGVs under 22 tons, that's been really clear and really consistent all the way along. And it's generally been the same in the EU. Now, I know the EU's wavering ever so slightly with potential for e-fuels, where we aren't, but ultimately it's still going to be zero emission only by 2035. I think that consistency of messaging and the fact that kind of the geographical area as a whole, which is what manufacturers work to, has been so clear all along, means that they know they don't really have a choice. By 2035, you need to be zero. So that's never really been part of the discussion. It was when it was first being mooted, but it's not now. I think for us, it's definitely more about the short-term targets in the ZEV mandate and how those can be flexed to help them in the near term. Now, depending on your point of view, you could say that, well, there's a lot of negative media that has swirled around electric vehicles, and ultimately this is a result of it. You could say actually the demand genuinely is below where, you know, it's beneath where we would expect it to be, and therefore manufacturers aren't selling the vehicles that our targets require them to do so. And, you know, there are geopolitical things in play as well. You know, the war in Ukraine and so on has had a significant impact on supply chains across Europe. So there are lots of different headwinds. They are very active. It's part of the reason why we've consulted on whether we should make the ZEV mandate a bit more flexible in the short term, which, you know, we'll have to see how that goes in due course. But yeah, they definitely are, they're an active group.
Hi, James. Anthony from ChargeNet. Just a quick question around grid supply. In New Zealand, in pockets of New Zealand, we have constraints around the grid. What have they done in the UK to allow legislation, etc., to allow CPOs to be placed in the key locations where there is grid constraint?
Well, you are getting to the edge of my knowledge with that. So in terms of, I know we have a significant program. So this is where most of OZEV is based in Department for Transport. We do have a team based in the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, whose entire job is basically that, to make sure that the grid can handle charging demand across the entirety of the UK. And then we have I think they're a semi-private body, semi-private, semi-public, or National Grid, that is responsible for the actual supply to homes and so on. National Grid has always been really clear that the grid as it currently stands is more than capable of meeting the projected electric demand when we get to fully zero emission. There will be things going on in the background, and that's one of the questions I'm going to take away, if I may. I will get you some bullets via the team later on this week.
Sorry, we're going to have to wrap it up there on questions. I know that there is some online, so James has kindly offered to respond to those. He's also making his slides available, and Hannah has organised the session to be recorded as well, which we can share with you, because James, that was power-packed, full of facts, and I feel like I need to watch it again. So thank you very much. And on behalf of SBN and Drive Electric, as a thank you, we're planting a native tree as part of Trees That Count, to say thank you very much for participating. And if everyone can just give a warm thanks. Yeah. We would love to transport you to New Zealand. So
I would love to join you at some point.
Please let us know. We'd give you a very warm welcome and introduce you to some politicians. It would be fabulous. Yeah.